Chapter 14, Screencast 1, Water. This chapter is actually subdivided into two parts. The first part is focusing on water, and the second part will be focusing on major minerals. Major minerals will be a separate series of screencasts. This first slide here is showing us overall the relationship between water and minerals within our body and all the various functions. And as we can see here, it should be pretty obvious that water and minerals are required for every single one of these functions. If we are talking about water and ion balance in cells, the regulation of blood pressure, bone health, blood clotting, nerve impulses, muscle contraction and relaxation, growth and development, cell metabolism, and last but not least, antioxidant defenses. So every single one of these functions relies very heavily on both water and major minerals. So please keep in mind, this is really why they are essential, because of the really important role they play overall in maintaining homeostasis. Now, unsurprisingly, water is the most essential of all nutrients, and maintaining water balance is essential to life. Adults can survive several weeks without food, but we can only go just a few days without water. We have absolutely no reserves for water in the body like we do for all other macronutrients. Now, what we need to approach here is, where do we find water within the body? And if we were to just take the average amount of water in an adult, it accounts for about 55% of an adult's total body weight. Individuals that are lean will actually have a greater percentage of water, and this is due to the fact that lean mass and muscle has much more water content than other tissues. Now, water is found in two separate compartments. Intracellular, and that accounts for 2/3 of total water within the body. So that is the largest of two compartments. Extracellular, this is going to be subdivided into two other compartments, and if we look at the language, extracellular, outside of the cells. This is interstitial fluid and intravascular fluid, such as plasma. If we think about interstitial fluid, sometimes you may see that referred to as the internal environment. If we look at the image to the right on this slide, if we look overall, total body water in this situation is approximately 40 liters. And what we see, 37% of that is found in the extracellular space, and the remaining 63% is intracellular fluid. If we break down to actually how much that is, about 25 liters is the amount of fluid found inside all of our cells. About 11 liters is making up interstitial fluid, and then we have 4 liters making up blood and lymph. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is there are going to be ions dissolved in this water. And if we look at intracellular fluid, the major cations are going to be potassium and magnesium. The major anion is going to be phosphate. When we compare that to extracellular fluid, sodium is the major cation and chloride is the major anion we find in extracellular fluid, or that fluid outside of our cells. Now here, this is basically looking at the different types of ions that we find in the intracellular versus extracellular fluid. If we look at the primary cations we expect to find in intracellular fluid, they're going to be potassium and magnesium, whereas the negatively charged particles we expect to find inside the cell are phosphate and sulfate. When we compare that to the outside, or our extracellular fluid, the major cations are sodium and calcium, and the primary negatively charged ions that we will find in the extracellular fluid will be chloride and bicarbonate. Now, here, what we're looking at is the sodium-potassium pump. And this is a cellular mechanism that plays a very important role in making sure that we're controlling the amount of water and fluid in these compartments. And what this does, the transmembrane pump, or sodium-potassium pump. It keeps normal water volume and electrolyte concentrations, and the sodium-potassium pump is moving ions against the concentration gradient. If we look at how this pump works, it is fueled by the hydrolysis of ATP. So this is an example of primary active transport, and the exchange goes as follows. The pump will pump out 3 sodium ions for every 2 potassium ions that are pumped in. And remember, since sodium is the primary extracellular ion, it requires active transport to get it out of the cell, and the same thing to get potassium inside of the cell. This cellular mechanism accounts for a significant portion of our overall metabolic rate. Now, when we think about water, it's going to be attached to electrolytes, and water will move via osmosis. So water is an important enough substance, it gets its own transport term. And generally, we're going to see water moving from high water to low water, but it's actually easier to think of it as water moving from the side with a low solute concentration to the side with a higher solute concentration. And we can use the saying, water follows solute, if it can, to describe osmosis. So solute exerts an osmotic force that draws water towards it. Now here, this is how we typically address the terms isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic. The middle panel, we basically look as an isotonic solution, and notice what we're seeing here is the ion concentration inside the cell is equal to that outside the cell, and notice there's going to be no change in the volume or size of that cell. There is no osmotic gradient that is going to cause water to move either into or out of that blood cell. If we look at a hypotonic situation, now the solute is located within the cell. So water now will move into the cell, and that cell can only expand so much, and eventually that cell will lyse. The opposite is going to be a hypertonic solution. This is when the solute concentration of the fluid outside the blood cell is greater, so water will leave the blood cell, and now that cell will actually shrivel.